Okay, next section. I'm not at the bottom of this one. No video at the bottom of this one. All right, so next section, what we're going to talk about in this part of the lecture, we're going to talk about the social distinctions. We talk about social distinctions. We're going to talk about the role of women. We're going to start talking about textile production and why it was different in Italy versus the other parts of the Renaissance, the other countries that we'll talk about the Renaissance later. Italians at this time, and actually still today, were, surrounded by the imposing ruins of the classical Roman period. You know, it had been the seat, the center of the Roman Empire, and as a result, as wealth grew, the interest in classical antiquity grew amongst intellectuals, the middle class, this burgeoning middle class, artistic communities in these city states that were ruled by princes. And part of what spurned the shift, I'm gonna keep using that word shift, we talked about in the discussion board, is they embraced this Renaissance group of those Renaissance men really embraced the humanistic approach of the classics. So they rejected, some of the narrow-mindedness that they saw in medieval time, and had a revived interest in classical literature and arts. And remember, if you think back to our lecture on Greece and Rome, I shared some stories and some poems from Greek and Roman historians and writers and poets at the time, and there was a resurgence in the study of these classical literature items. And what were the politics of these princes and this merchant class? Because again, at the time, Italy was a conglomeration of kind of city states. It was, not a country, but just a geographic area made of a bunch of city states ruled by princes, sometime of ancient noble heritage, sometimes military commanders who had taken over, sometimes just members of wealthy merchant families. If you ever heard of the Medici family, they were an ancient family. There's actually a whole TV show you can watch on Netflix about the Medicis and how they exerted power with their wealth. And even though many of them were violent and oppressive and cruel, they were also benevolent at the same time. So they were patrons of the artists and of great thinkers, and know artists that such as Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo actually were sponsored by some of these great princes and wealthy merchants. And the political organization did spurn the shift in in garments and textiles, and most of the representations that we see, these images that we've been looking at so far and what we'll look at going forward, are actually of this prince and wealthy merchant class. So what was life like, right? What were the social distinctions that, as we've been talking about? And in the Renaissance, Italy was divided into the aristocracy, the merchant class, artisans. And artisans included anyone who was skilled at a craft, and textile creation was an artisan craft. Town laborers and peasants, and some families did have slaves that were domestic help, not the same type of slavery that we had in the United States, but they did have slaves, and usually they were Eastern European slaves, so they were from Mongolia, Turkey, and Russia. And men made up the ruling class, not surprising. And many of these men generally came from a merchant class, right? And those that came from the merchant class generally became more respectable by marrying into a more noble family. So what was the role of women, right? What was the role of women like in this society? Because like I said, they got married off, all right? They got married off to these wealthy merchants because, men inherited all the wealth in a family, and even if the family was solely of a female lineage, if there were no men left in the family, only a small portion would be handed down to the woman, and the rest would be handed to an uncle or a cousin. And much of the family's wealth actually was invested in making a marriageable daughter, right? Having somebody that somebody else wanted to marry, that had a sufficiently large enough dowry, and a dowry is just, I don't want to say a fee, but it really is. It's an amount of money that you get to take somebody's daughter. I hate to say it that way, but that's really what it is. So, um, so that was unfortunate. That was the role of women in the upper classes, was to marry somebody that could take care of her and her family. And sometimes families that couldn't marry off their daughters to wealthy enough merchants, or couldn't make a good match, would actually send their daughters off to convents to be married to the Lord. In towns such as Florence and Genoa, textile industry was very prominent. So weaving, dyeing, finishing, or trading cloth. So in these industries, sons were trained to take over the family business, and skilled artisans could do well. Unskilled laborers, on the other time, had difficulty just managing feeding and clothing themselves, just like in our current society, right? Unskilled low paid folks have difficulty feeding themselves. And then of course at the bottom rung were the peasants who farmed the land outside of the city, and often they worked in a sharecropping basis with the owners, where um, a landowner owns the land, they work the land, and they get a share of the crop. That's where the word sharecropping comes from. But owners always manage a way so that the sharecropper never breaks even, right? They always owe them something, so they're tied to the land. So really, they are peasants. They will be working that land for life, because there were very few opportunities for them to get from under the landowner's thumb. In spite of all that, in spite of whatever economic difficulties, people from all levels, actually the lower levels, so the unskilled laborers, artisans, and even the skilled artisans, the unskilled laborers, the peasant class, um, like I said, sometimes the artisan class, they still wanted to imitate upper class society's dress. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Right? They still want to do that. So there were sumptuary laws again, right? There were sumptuary laws in Italian cities where we still have archival records that indicate a whole bunch of regulations that regarding dress. So again, what fabrics you could wear, what colors you could wear, what styles you could wear. Sumptuary laws never go away. And one Renaissance author has summarized it by saying everyone should dress well according to their age and position in society. And if he doesn't, it's a mark of contempt on other people. So basically, like, if you're not dressing right, you're showing your contempt for your fellow man. So again, those sumptuary laws regulated the number of items of clothing an individual could acquire, as well as the type of materials they could have and what type of ornamentation they could have. And remember, we talked about in early Europe and the Byzantine Empire how the value of clothing would be passed down, and the sumptuary laws here actually limited how many items of clothing you could actually own. So, with that number of items that you could own in the nobility, so the aristocracy and the wealthy merchant class, and even some of the artisan class, just depending on who you employed, it was the responsibility of the head of the household to clothe the members of the household. So, if you were a servant, it wasn't your job to purchase your clothes. It was the responsibility of the head of the household. And for this aristocratic classes, they had a whole bunch of people that they may have to clothe. So there actually is a set of clothing. It was called the garadoba that they were responsible for supplying to the folks in their household. And it's 2 layers of indoor clothing, and then a mantle for the outdoors. And the term gardoba is comparable for the outdoor garment is comparable to the word robe that we currently use today. And in middle class, artisan class families, one new set of clothing was ordered each year. So you got 3 items every year. And discarded clothing was passed along to the poor, either by outright donating it or selling secondhand clothing. So hopefully you remember when we talked about Rome, we talked about how it was one of the first places that wool was woven and mass produced, and we talked about how there were certain cities that were known for production of clothing. And by this time, Italian textiles were widely used throughout Europe for a couple of reasons. Wool was the primary fabric woven in Italy, and silk was right behind it. So by this point, the production of silk had developed in European countries, but also because of Italy's space where it was in the Mediterranean Sea and on that Silk Road, silk was also imported from the Eastern world. And many of these Italian wool fabrics were made from wool that came as far away as Britain. And silk, wool, cotton, and linen were all fabrics that were used in Italian dress. And the description of Italian wool production in the trade city of Prato gives us a overview of the production of textiles throughout Europe. So there is proof that there was a separation of what people did. So there were people that just washed and prepared the fiber for spinning. There were those who spun the yarn and prepared it for the loom. There were people that just did the weaving, and the weaving was done partially in factories. You can't see my air quotes, right? In factories, but also was done at home. Dyers were members of a artisan class, people that dyed wool, and they were also finishers who did clipping and mending and folding, that had their own workshops. So that was just the textile production. That doesn't even include the production of garments.